Okay, I hope you can see that now. Peter,
Yep.
I'm looking at you because I can see your video. So yeah, cool. Thank you. So test project, automation for the many, not the few, which may have been stolen from someone else, but the principle applies here. So first of all, a little bit about me. I'm Ryan. I'm a software tester and have been for about 10 years now. I live in Norwich. I like coffee, cats, I like sport, and I like gin every so often. And I really dislike not having coffee. So that's me. So what is Test Project? So this quote is taken directly from the Test Project website. So Test Project is a free end-to-end test automation platform for web, mobile, and API testing that's supported by the #1 test automation community. But what does that mean? Well, it means several things. First of all, it's a test automation tool. Secondly, it focuses on testing web, mobile, and APIs. And it's got this really great test community behind it, which is one of its real strengths compared to other tools in the industry. So to continue that a bit, so Test Project is completely open source. It's predominantly used for UI mobile testing, but not exclusively. You can do API testing as well. But for me, I think the real strength here is, certainly at the moment, is UI and mobile testing. And it utilizes Selenium and Appium to enable users to create robust automation tests by recording actions. So obviously Selenium and Appium are two of the most high-profile tool sets, APIs for testing UI and mobile applications. So I think it's really great that Test Project's built on top of these. So why should you consider Test Project over just using Selenium or Cypress or any other UI automation tool, or Appium for mobiles, or any other tool for API testing? Well, first of all, it's really easy to get started. There's not a huge download process or install process. The steps to create your first test are fairly straightforward. So you can be up and running within hours, not days, not weeks. And I think it's fairly intuitive. So I don't think you need to go away and get formal training or spend lots of time on Stack Overflow, googling questions. No real dependencies, except you do have to have Chrome to record. But on top of that, all you need is a free Test Project account, and you need to download an agent, which I'll explain a bit more about in a minute. Test Project has a really active community, so it has a great blog, it has great documentation, and it has a community that chats a lot, and that feeds into one of Test Project's core features of add-ons, which is essentially the ability for users to create additional functionality for Test Project and share that with others, either within their own team or to the wider Test Project community. And it's free. So I guess one of the there was a survey done recently, actually, which said cost of test automation tools was one of the big blockers along with skill set needed. And I think TestProject goes a long way to mitigate some of these reasons and help to resolve them. And it offers easy collaboration. So TestProject is cloud-based, and what that means is you don't need to use tools like GitHub or SVN or any other repository service, GitLab. What you can do is you can add team members to your TestProject instance, and you can collaborate with those team members on that single instance, which again is great. And integrations. So TestProject has a growing list of integrations that make this really powerful tool. So some of the biggies are Source Labs and Browser, which allow you to run your automation tests on thousands of browsers and devices, which you might not have on site. So that's great. It's also got integration with Slack. It's got some really powerful SDK for Java and C#. And they've just announced integration with Qtest, which is a test management tool. On top of that, it has an API. It's got an exposed API, so you can integrate with your CI/CD pipeline. So if you're using Azure DevOps or this Jenkins integration or Circle CI, you can use the API to trigger test runs. It's also got its internal monitor, so you can set up your own jobs inside TestProject and run them direct from on a schedule from TestProject. So I am going to give a demo. So for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to focus on UI testing. I think most of the principles still apply to mobile testing. What you can do with mobile testing is you can connect, for example, you can connect an Android device direct to your laptop, and you can run TestProject tests directly on that phone. But for the purpose of this, I am going to run a UI test. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from scratch. So here I am in my TestProject application. See, these are projects that I've already worked on, so I can drill down into any of these and see tests that I've already written. I'm just going to draw your attention to this agents feature here. So an agent is the tool which actually runs your tests. So an agent can be installed on any machine, a Windows machine, Linux, iOS, and what you can do is you can have multiple agents linked to a project. So I'm going to start up my agent here. You can see down here that it's now starting up. So in a minute that will be running. And if I go back to my application, you can see that it's starting here. So in this instance, I only have a single agent running on my machine. But like I said, I could have multiple agents on various virtual machines with different browsers and different configurations on. And if I wanted to run my tests on any of those machines, then I can select the agent I want to run on. For now, I've only got one, so I'll run on that. So I'll go back to my home page, and I'm going to create a new project, and I'll call it EAQA project. Create that. And I'm going to create a brand new test straight away. So I'm now inside my project, and I'm going to create a test. And in this instance, I'm going to create a web test. Give a day, name, and a form. Registration test. And now I'm going to select the web application that I want to test. So I'm going to use a test application written by Kevin Tuck, who I think may be on the call. And essentially this website just allows you to register a user. Once you're registered, you can log in and add to-dos and delete to-dos. I'm just going to focus on the registration process at the moment, and I'm going to navigate directly to the registration page in my project. So I'm going to add a new application, call it to do. I'm going to post in my URL there and finish. So you could have multiple applications in a single project. In this instance, I've just got the one, which is selected. So I'll hit next. And I'm going to record this test. And this is one of the great features about TestProject, is that I don't have to dive straight into code. I can record a test. And I think that's really great. So I'm going to hit record and I'm going to start testing. So the first thing this is going to do is this is going to launch a new instance of the Chrome browser, and it's going to navigate me direct to my application URL that I've provided. So this is where you do need Chrome to run this recording. Once your test is recorded, you don't have to run those tests on Chrome. So you can run them on any browser on the machine that your test agent is connected to. So first thing it's done is it's created me this test window here, and it's actually created me the first step, which is navigate to my URL. It's stored this URL in a parameter, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. But the first thing I want to do is I want to fill in this registration form, and all I need to do to record that test is start typing. So you can see every time I type something in, it's recording that action in this test window here. I'm going to click register here. Okay, so I've created my test here. I've managed to get all the way through the registration page, and I've got this congratulations message here. And it's given me all of these steps. But one thing I might want to do as a tester is I might want to find a way to validate that that test has passed. So at the moment, I'm just performing a number of steps, but there's no validation in here to prove that what I've done has resulted in what I'm expecting to happen. So I could do something like try and log in with that user, but in this instance, I'm just going to validate that this message contains the text that I see here. So I'm going to just take a copy of that. And I'm going to highlight it, and then I'm going to hit double shift. And that's going to freeze my screen and give me these options here. So what I could do is I could perform an action on that. So maybe my action is grab the text from that string. In this instance, I'm going to do a validation. Should come up with just cancel that a second, sorry. load up again. So again, this is just going to load the browser up. I'll just go through that again. Use a different username. Register. Here you go. So I think I was clicking on the wrong element before. Okay, but now, so what I can do is I can click on this validation, and in this instance, I'm going to check it contains text. So this brings up this create step window here. So the text I want to check against is congratulations. So I'm going to create that step. And what it's done is it's actually run that step for me, and it's given me this little green line here, which tells me that that step's actually passed. So I'm quite happy with this test. Works, and I've validated this field here. So there are various different ways you can validate a field. So in this instance, I'm just doing contains text, which might not be the necessarily the best way of doing this. I might want to check that a string matches a pattern, a predefined pattern, rather than just contains text. But in this instance, I will keep it as it is. And to stop this test, all I need to do is close the browser. So that's created my test here. So I can drill down into it. And it's got all my steps here. And actually, it's okay, but it's a bit messy. I don't necessarily want to click into each of these boxes. So before I type, so what I can do is I can just tidy up a bit. So maybe I just delete the ones I don't need. So delete this one. Okay, so this is a bit better now. So now I am typing in the 4 fields that I want to type into, submitting it, and validating the message. And that's great. And if I save and exit out of this, I can rerun this test, and it will work. Other than the fact that I've already created this user. So I'm just going to go into one of these steps. Just slightly change the data. Save that. Save and exit. I'm going to click run to run this test. And when it does, it gives me an option to select my agent. I only have one here. And then select the browser I want to run this on. So I've got several browsers to select available to me on this machine, but I'm going to stick with Chrome for now. So I'll hit next, and I'll use the URL that I've already stored. So I'll run that now. So you can see that this is running as we speak. It's going to load up the page just as it did last time. It's going to enter the details, hit register, and close the browser. So I appreciate that was really quick. You may not have seen what's happened. So what I can do is if I go to reports here, I can see a list of jobs and tests which have recently been run. So this one here, reg test, is the one we've just run a few seconds ago. If I click on here, it gives me the full details of that test. So it tells me which browser it ran on, it tells me which agent, when it was run, and the percentage of steps passed. Down this right-hand side, it then gives me a detailed view of each step and what's happened. Again, green indicating that that step's passed, which is great. So our test has worked perfectly. And that's a basic web test. So let's see if we can make that test a bit better. So I'm going to go back into my project. I'm going to open up my test, and actually what I might quite like to do is parameterize some of these values. And that's the equivalent of a variable you might come across in Selenium. And it just allows you to reuse values within a test, and it helps you. It means you can change those values a bit easier. You can also use values across a project. So if you wanted to use the same value in multiple tests, you can create global parameters. So for instance, if I enter this step here where I'm typing John 1, instead of doing this, I'm going to add a parameter. And what I need to do is create a new parameter. So my only one at the moment is my URL. So I'm going to add a new parameter. I'm going to call it username, and I'm going to give it a value of Simon. I'm going to add that parameter, and you can see that it's already appended it to this field here. So what you can do is you can link parameterized values to string values. So if I wanted to put Simon Jones, I could do something like that. So that will input the parameter as well as the string text that I've added. In this instance, I'll keep it as Simon, and I'll confirm that. And you can see that in this field now we've got a box, and it tells that I'm typing whatever's in that username field here. So I'll just do the same for email. I'll add a new parameter, email. So I'll add that, get rid of the original text, save that. And I'll just do the same for password here as well. Get rid of that. Okay, so that's my password. You can make these secret as well if you want to get a bit more secure. I'll keep it open at the moment. Okay, so I've parameterized username, email, and password, but I've still got this one here as a text field. And actually, I want this to be exactly the same as this password here. So what I can do is I can go straight in here, get rid of this value, and I can reuse that same parameter here. So again, if I change it once, it changes it for both of those fields. Okay, so again, I've created my test. I've now got parameters. And if I rerun that test now, select Chrome again, it now gives me the option to override those parameters. So in this instance, where every time I run the test, it creates a user, and I can't then recreate that user. If I'm maybe running this locally, debugging a test, then I can change this every time if I wish. I'll keep it as it is now because I haven't used these values, and I'll just run again. So again, okay, so that test is run. It's used my parameterized values, and if I go back to reports, I can see that it's successfully run and passed. You can take it a step further with parameters, and what you can do is from a test, you can create a data source template CSV. If I open that up now in Excel, you can see that it's created me a template with all of my parameters for that test, which means I could add multiple values in these, and when I run a test, I can select the data source and it will run that test for as many rows as I've got in here. So if I've got 5 users that I want to register, I can add it all in here, and I can run the test against that file, and it will just run the 5 times through input and input each row of data. I won't do that though. So what does a test look like if it fails? I'll show you. I'll use my same test again, but I'm going to change this validation rule at the bottom here. So instead of checking that the text is this, I'm going to check the text is hello, for example. Again, it's worth mentioning here that I can parameterize all this. So if I want to store a string in a parameter and compare it against a parameter, I can do that. I won't. I'll just keep it as hello for now. I'll save that. I will run that test again next, but this time I will change the data because I've just used this data. Okay, so I'm going to run that now. Again, it's going to open up the browser. It's going to run, and actually this time what it hasn't done is close the browser really quickly, and that's because that last step's got a timeout on. So at the moment it's trying to validate that result, and because it hasn't been able to, it waits a little while and then closes. Those timeouts are configurable, so you can configure a timeout per step or per test. Equally, you can configure a failure result per step as well. So if you want a step to fail a whole test, you can do that. But if you want if a step fails, to continue test or run another step, then you can configure that as well. So I've run this test now. So I'll go back to my reports. Did that run? Yeah. Okay. So you can see that actually I've run this 3 times. The first 2 times it passed. The one I've just run, it's failed. So again, I can drill down into that. It gives me the full details of that test. So percentage of steps passed and failed. And again, down this right-hand side, you can see what steps have passed and what steps have failed. So I'm going to go straight to my failed step here, click on that. And what this gives me is not only the details of what that step was doing, what the timeout was, but it also produces a screenshot for me. So I can click on that screenshot. And I don't know how clear it is for you, but for me, I can see the screenshot says, "Congratulations, you are now registered," which isn't the text that my test was expecting to see. Again, these screenshots are configurable, but they're a really handy way of just seeing upfront what's happened to that, what's happened in that step, and why it's failed. So this is configured at the moment to take a screenshot for each failed step. So I'll just close that down. And I'll go back into my project. Go back into my test. I'm just going to revert this back to how it was. That. So I'll save that. So obviously this is not generally how we run tests, one at a time, locally. So what you can do, as I mentioned earlier, is set up jobs to run on a schedule or ad hoc, but this allows you to group tests together and run on multiple browsers. So within my project, I can set up this now. So again, I'm going to create a job to run on the web. Call it demo job. And I can select which browsers I want this test to run on. So in this instance, I'm going to select Chrome and Firefox. So I'm going to run it on 2 browsers, and I'm actually going to restart the browser. If I was running multiple tests, I might want to restart the browser before each test. In this instance, I've only got a single test running, so it doesn't really make any difference. But this might be a good idea if you have a suite of tests. So I'm going to create that, and I'm going to drop in my first test, my only test in this instance. So here, what I can do is I can actually run it as an on-demand batch job, or I can schedule a time for this to run, maybe overnight, or maybe you want to run it every day at a certain time, or overnight every day, or at the end of every week. In this instance, I'll just keep it as on demand. But what I will do is add some form of notification. So I'm going to add an email notification and a Slack notification. And I'm going to do it on both the start and the finish of a job. And the same with the Slack as well. So for the email, I'm going to select my own email address. You can select multiple if you want. And for Slack, I'm going to click on here, and I'm going to select my Slack channel, which is previously been configured. So you have to link this Slack to TestProject, but I've already done that. So I'm going to save that. Just going to check my parameters. Change those. And I'm going to run my job. Okay. Run here. So you can see that this job has now started. And again, it's going to start with the Chrome browser. A few small details. Just close that for a second. Okay, so let's try that again. Okay, it's registered that user, it's completed the test in Chrome, and now it's loading up Firefox, and it's going to run the same test, which is going to fail because it's the same credentials, but that doesn't matter so much. So I'll just let it complete the timeout, and once that's completed, it will it'll close down, and we'll check those results. Okay, so that's finished. So I'm going to go to reports here again, and you can see in this instance it's reporting that a job's been run. So I'm going to click on here. Okay, so now what I get is a little bit more detail. So now I can see that the results are reporting in tests rather than steps. So in this instance, I've got 50% of my tests passed and 50% failed. And down here, you can see the success ratio per browser. So my Chrome test, 100% of my Chrome tests passed, but 0% of my Firefox tests passed. And again, down the right-hand side, I can drill down into step. So my Firefox test failed at the last step, and that's because we didn't get that congratulations message because that user already existed. But you get the idea of how a job would run, and obviously this data becomes a bit more valuable when you've got loads more tests in your job. So I just wanted to touch on add-ons a little bit. So in my test there, I didn't use any external add-ons, but I could have done if I wanted. If I click on add-ons here, each one of these items here represents an add-on either produced by the test project team, or by individuals who have contributed. If I drill down into one of these, so string utils, for example, it gives me a set of functionality that add-on provides. So as I mentioned earlier, if we wanted to compare two strings together rather than validate contains text, we could use compare two strings. We could install this, which I already have, and that allows me to use the action compare two strings. Equally, there's some add-ons to support PDFs, reading PDFs, storing, reporting stuff locally, so outputting to files. There's an add-on I was playing with earlier to validate screenshots. So on that congratulations page, for example, I could take a screenshot and then compare that directly to a screenshot I've stored. There's several others for encoding, talking to databases, and many others that I haven't mentioned. And this is one of the real strengths of TestProject is these add-ons allow you to add this functionality. But equally, you're not overcrowded. If you don't need it, you don't have to install it, which can keep things clean. So you can see that these are the add-ons that I've currently got installed. There's a RESTful API client, which is useful for testing, not only testing REST services, but it's quite useful for integrating with UI tests. So if you want to do some data setup, maybe create a user using an API before you then go on to do the login test or something like that, that's really useful. Yeah, so there's some really great stuff in here. And just want to touch on integrations as well. So these are some of the integrations we mentioned earlier. So there is the API, so you can integrate with your CI/CD pipeline. There's also integration with Source Labs and Browser Stack, which is all built in. Qtest is the new integration. We also have these SDKs. So what this allows you to do is write coded Selenium tests or Appium tests in either C# or Java, and you can then import those tests into TestProject. So if you have a set of coded Selenium tests, you can download the TestProject SDK, work within the SDK, and then eventually you can import those tests back in. It also means you can write your own add-ons and add those to your project as well. So currently you can only do this in Java, but they're exposing a JavaScript, a Python, and a Groovy SDK later this year, I think. I think that's about it. So there's some really great stuff coming up with TestProject. It seems to be evolving quite quickly, and they're rewriting the recorder at the moment, I think. So at the moment, if you've got a website with a lot of iframes, then it's quite tricky to automate using the record. But that should change soon, and you should be able to record iframes in exactly the same way as I've just shown you, recording that registration page. I really like this tool, and I like it because I don't consider myself a UI automation tester. And I hear that a lot, that teams don't have the experience or knowledge, or a bit scared of picking up a tool set like Selenium. But actually this tool gives you the ability to write good UI based tests without needing to have that knowledge. And I kind of feel that that's probably better than no automation at all. If you can write some good tests in TestProject, then I think that's a great thing for your project. So I think that's it for the demo, but there's a whole ton more that I haven't touched on, and I'd advise you to create an account and have a look around and play with it. It's super intuitive, and it's nice to play with. So yeah, have a play. And if you do have any questions, then let me know.
Ryan, is it only available in the cloud, or if you are forced to run on air gaps, are you screwed?
It's only available. So the test runners, the test agents are local, but the tests are stored in the cloud.
That's a shame.
Which is yeah, I can see. I recently demoed this to a company who had a similar concern. But equally,
open source. Can you not just run the whole thing up in a Docker on site and have done with it?
There is some Docker integration, but I'm not quite sure how it works. It's not something I've played with, but I'm sure you can add the you can install the agents via a Docker container. But as far as I'm aware, the actual tests are stored in the cloud.
Right.
But equally, a lot of these tools that you do run locally, you end up storing your tests in something like GitHub. Anyway, so I've seen companies where there was some concern around running this in the cloud, or having it stored in the cloud, but they were quite happy to use.
If it was in the cloud, it would be in a private cloud. It wouldn't be on their cloud. That's the trouble. So
yeah.
The reasons are dull, but they are what they are. So they ain't going to change.
No.
So, I was quite excited for a bit.
It's a cool.
Oh, it looks cool, but unfortunately, if it's not available for use, it's not available for use. So
sure.
It's just the way life is.
Hi Ryan. Actually, what if the values you just passed on each username and email? Why can't we make them dynamic?
You can.
Okay.
So there's
a possibility of doing that. So
you can create you can create parameters as you go. So one example of that might be that so I've got a test in one of my other projects that registers. It does exactly the same registration process that I've done now, but it does it using the API. The test itself is just testing the login process via the UI. So what the API does is it registers your user and is returned a token. So in order to use that in the next test, I store it as a parameter as part of that step.
Yeah, so like sometimes there is no API available. In that case, every time the test runs, then in Java we can dynamically create a new user every time with you can just like John 1 to 3, next time John 1 to 4 or something like
Yeah, so there is there's an add-on which allows you to create random, here you go, random login credentials. I haven't used it, but you can use stuff like that to dynamically create users, so you don't have to necessarily go in each time and create change that data. So you can. I haven't played around with this, but it's certainly possible to generate some of that stuff. There's a couple of data generation add-ons. I can see the two here: login credentials and data generator. There's another one I think for like generating telephone numbers and various strings and stuff. So yeah, it's entirely possible to create that stuff dynamically.
Yeah, and one other thing was to suppose if there is an existing Selenium project, can we import that and run without doing anything else?
No, I don't think you can. I think you need to integrate it with you need to download the SDK first.
Yeah, so that means you need to migrate existing project by integrating the test project SDK first.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Anyone else have any questions?
Is there a cost for it or not? It seems to say free, but then talks about a pricing plan, so I can't actually find any indication of a pricing plan. So.
No, it's completely free. There's no, so it's it was acquired by Tricentis maybe last year. So Tricentis offer paid tools, so they have their own automation testing tools which are paid. TestProject is completely open source, and they're quite committed to being free and always being free.
So what's in it for them?
Well, there's a couple of things. I guess it expands their community. It brings people to Tricentis through TestProject. And the other thing they do is they do these integrations. So they've just announced integration with Qtest. Qtest is a paid Tricentis product. So if they can get people on board with TestProject, then I guess the idea is that in the future people might pick up something like Qtest because there's a direct integration there. But I think they're quite committed to this community project, and they're not the only company to produce and maintain open source applications, which might seem a bit strange on the offset, but I think it's that idea of at the very least at the very least we're now having a conversation about Tricentis. Had we not have had a demo about TestProject, we probably wouldn't be talking about Tricentis currently.
Alternatives that do a similar thing, or have you not found anything that kind of has the same?
So there's lots of tools out there. So there's a big move towards vendor-based tools. So there's a whole bunch of good vendor-based tools which allow you to record tests in the same way and give you that extraction from the code. So most of them are paid. Some of them do like a tiered option. So you might get the free version gives you 100 runs, but if you want 100 runs a month or something, but if you want to do unlimited, then you have to pay. I think the closest that you can get without paying is Catalan Studio. Do a pretty good free version. And then they do a tiered enterprise version, which you pay for. The thing with Catalan Studio is some of the functionality you don't get unless you pay for. So I don't think the reporting is very good out of the box, and there are other features that you don't get. But that's probably the closest the closest equivalent. I think the things which set this apart are it is free, which is there's not many tools out there doing this amount of functionality for free.
It's a slightly curious open source, and there's absolutely no indication of where the source is. Having looked.
Yeah, I see what you mean. You can't download the project from.
You can't download the
GitHub.
project, which just sounds like it's not open source.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And I'm dealing with paranoid people, so it looks brilliant. It covers a whole bunch of things that I'd love, but if we can't validate it, we can't use it. So therefore, that's why it doesn't get to run on the cloud. So
sure.
And Ryan, Giri here. Just wanted to add on top of what you have shown with the features. In fact, TestProject is coming up with the PDF testing as well. So there is a plugin that they have added recently.
There is,
called
yes.
PDF Actions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I work for a bank. So from the banking and insurance sector perspective, validating PDFs, it's quite a tedious task. So I think that feature is quite useful for us. So I thought of just iterating it here.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's one of the great things. So you're right, the PDF thing is fairly new, and in fact, it's add-on of the week at the moment.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think one of the great things about TestProject is these add-ons are coming in all the time, which is great. So the functionality is increasing all the time. One of the ones I played with today that I did mention briefly is the screenshot validation stuff, which is good enough to get to do some screenshot validation. I did it on that screen that we were just testing on. So I did screenshot validation to check that congratulations message came up. I tested a pass case and I tested a failed one. It told me the failed one. It told me something like 0.8% of the screenshot was different. And you can change the tolerance. So if you're happy that maybe 5% of the screenshot is different because it will show a different username or something like that, then again, it's a nice add-on.
Yeah, and good thing with TestProject is, Ryan, so if there is a special requirement for someone, if we approach them, they will be able to create a separate add-on for yourself or develop that particular feature for yourself. That is really good with community work actually.
Yeah, it's really great. So if you, what I think would work really well is if you don't have the skill set of maybe your whole team being able to pick up something like Selenium, what you could have is maybe a dedicated resource for to create the required add-ons or more complex tests which you might want to use code for. And then you, like you say, you can import those directly into your project, and that means any of the other testers using your project can then just import those into their test. The other thing we didn't quite touch on, which is a useful feature, is you can run tests within tests. So you can't. It hasn't got a repository like a page object model repository in the same way other tools do. But what you can do is, if I open up my to-do project, which I'm not sharing screen, am I? But I'll share this very quickly. So I've got this to-do project here, and I've actually only got 5 actual tests in this project, but I've got a whole bunch of steps. And the reason I've done this is because I've now got steps. So I've stored all my log out steps in a single test. It might only be 1 step, or my login steps somewhere. And all my API calls are stored in individual tests. So when I actually want to run my add to do test, for example, what I do is I can call out other tests. So in this instance, I'm calling, it's not very clear unless you know what's going on, but in this instance, I'm calling my register API test, and then I'm calling my login steps. And then I'm actually doing my test, and then I'm calling a delete user API. So my test is only really steps 5, 6, and 7. Everything else is other tests that I've written and can reuse multiple times. So my login steps I use in every test that I need to log in. We didn't really cover that in the demo, but again, that's really useful. Any other questions?
Is there any integration in Jenkins?
Yes, there is. So there is a dedicated Jenkins integration. But as I say, there's also an API, so you can actually integrate into any CI/CD tool that you're using. So there's an article recently about integrating with Azure DevOps, utilizing the API. In that API, you can execute the tests and run jobs. So you just specify, you call whatever job you want to run.
Yeah, and always the test is not easy. Sometimes you may try to find out one or other elements, try catch or doing something like that. So how do we achieve that here?
So there's no try catch functionality as such, and it's a little bit tricky to do sort of if statements in a way. So it's a bit more tricky to do if value is A, do 1, if value is B, do 2, from the UI. But so it's not easy to do that, but you can do that sort of thing if you export to and write the tests in code and then import.
And can we write the code just for that particular step, you mean? Or you...
So you can write code to do essentially any steps you want, and then you can run that as an individual test on its own. So it might be a test of you could write that whole registration test in code and import that and run it, or you could just write the login steps, for example, in code if that bit was slightly more complicated, and then you could call that within your recorded test.
Right. Okay.
So for example, at the moment, iframes is something that there is an add-on for, which can get you by. But if you had a web page or an application heavily reliant on iframes, it'd be quite tricky to automate that using TestProject as it is now, until the new release, which I think is fairly imminent in the next few weeks. But that's an example of where you'd probably want to currently write the test in Java or C# and then import it.
Yep.
But I genuinely think this tool is only going to get better in terms of the new releases and the add-ons, and you'll be able to do more and more via the record function.
How much of the resources are free to use? Like, is there any number of tests on free version to use?
No, it's all free. You can run as many tests as you want, as regularly as you want. There's no limit on that side of things. So the only things you do have to pay for, if you want them, is the integration. So you'd have to have a Qtest license if you want to use Qtest. And the same with Source Labs or Browser Stack. Again, if you haven't got a license for those third-party applications, you won't be able to use them. But as far as TestProject goes, it's free.
How does it work in the parallel execution?
So it doesn't. So you can't run tests in parallel what you can do is you can run them, as I showed you, on multiple. So you can select multiple browsers and run them, but it'll run one set of tests on a browser and then run the same set of tests on the next browser and so on. It doesn't run them in parallel.
So if you're automating with something like Jenkins, do you end up having to have an actual headed display to running on a workstation to make this work? Or can we just, I mean, our preference is to have no user devices whatsoever. So we're using Selenium at the moment, that just works fine. But Appium is another thing, and then iOS. This looks like it potentially covers all the bases.
So,
but I'm struggling to see how it fits if you have to have a UI running to make that possible.
So you don't, because you can call the API. So you can basically, set up your projects and your jobs within the UI, and then via the API you can call those. You just have a key basically, which allows you to talk to your test project instance, and that allows you to.
So you have to call the API on the cloud, which then talks to your agent locally to cause it to run a test that you want to be done.
Yes,
right.
Unless you're using something like Source Labs or Browser Stack, which obviously that's not on-prem, but that allows you to then sort of specify the browsers or the devices that you want to run on.
I'm still liking it enough to want to find a way to be able to use it, but everything seems to get in the way. It's like they don't want it to be used on large scale. We do all our testing captive, so there is no connection to anything.
Okay.
So,
is there any debugging logs, like not just the elements or something, maybe network traffic or something like that? If the application network, I meant to say.
Not so much. No. Again, there was a video recently that someone produced. It might be on TestProject, a blog about debugging in TestProject. So there's no real logs as such. You can drill down into a test and only run certain steps, and obviously it does produce the report after running, but as far as I'm aware, there's no like a console log output that you can read. I must stress here, actually, I'm certainly not an expert at this product, so I'm hoping the information I'm giving you is accurate, and I think it mostly is, but
have you used it in anger then in the actual test cases, or are you?
So yeah. So I've set up projects, and I'm using it to test with. Nothing overly complex at the moment, which is nice in a way. So it can kind of, because it's quite simplistic in a way, it can kind of keep you a little bit straight, and allows you, it kind of makes you focus on what you maybe should test and not necessarily what you can test. So where it's really useful is if you want to write, if you've got a web application, for example, and you want to write, a set of robust, really focused, targeted tests to register a user, log in, create whatever it is you want to create. It's really useful for that stuff. The more complex stuff is where you need to start using the SDK. Anything from anyone else? Okay. Well, I think that's it. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and thanks to the guys at TestProject who have been providing me with some demos and information, which has been really useful. And hopefully I'll see some of you again on future meetups.